India has always been diverse, but we did not have social media.
This is the science behind Krish Ashok's Instagram play.
Yes. The soundtrack of, say, Punnagai Mannan, right? You can hear all those genres in one film soundtrack. These were like Malayalis who left Calicut 20 years ago, live in the Bay Area. You need to go there and eat. It's like, are you guys kidding me?
ഈ മഹാരാജ്യത്തിലെ ഒരു ചെറിയ വിഭാഗം ജനങ്ങൾ മാത്രം സംസാരിക്കുന്നതാണ് എൻ്റെ ഭാഷ. പക്ഷേ ഞങ്ങളുടെ ഭാഷ സജീവമാണ്, ചലനാത്മകമാണ്.
Is there a relationship between music and food in your mind? Because you talk about you can't objectively study music,
Yes.
but it's a misconception.
Yeah,
the
correct.
same misconception that you have with food and all that.
Not really. So I think it's just in my case. I was a musician since I was 7, right? I was playing the violin. So I was actually a musician well before I started to learn to cook and all of that. So for me, using musical metaphors comes more naturally, right? So that's the only reason. That said, of course, there is a biological basis to music, right? I mean, the notes, the sarigama, padani, etc., are all results of specific ratios of vibrating strings, right? Inside your ear, and the physics of your ear is what determines what music is, right? In that sense. But also in a deeper sense, there is a commonality at the level of how you think about knowledge of anything, right? I mean, it's just like how you can learn music by simply saying, I will learn 10 songs, one song, second song, third song, right? I mean, that's the equivalent of recipes, right? I learn cooking by recipes. But if you step one level above, right? I mean, in music, you kind of think about what are the notes, how do they actually mix together, what notes go well together, what is the raga, what is the harmony, what is the melody. The idea is that you can apply the same thing to cooking as well, right? So the meta knowledge is where I think there are things that are far more common than we give credit for, right?
There are common things that people talk about. You know, how they talk about music is similar to how they talk about food. Like you can't compose music like Ilayaraja.
Yes.
You can't. My mother's food.
Yes,
you know,
yes,
that
yes.
can't be replicated.
Yes, yes.
Where do these similarities come from?
So this kind of comes from music and food share one particular commonality in how our brains are wired, in that both food and music can evoke strong memories and nostalgia. So the reason, for example, that people get attached to certain songs, right, is not because the song was technically perfect or that it had the flawless singing. That's less important than the song meaning something to you at an important point in your life, right? So you were in love and you heard something, and 20 years later, that song will still evoke those same emotions, right? And in much the same way, what flavor is a series of these multi-dimensional memories that you store by eating your mother's food, your grandmother's food during summer holidays, and so on. So much later in life, that's what you will identify with, and that's what is strongly evocative. And also why, when you hear something that's a little bit different, when you eat something that's a little bit different or hear something that's a little bit different, most of us find it hard to appreciate. So a very small number of people are able to say, yeah, this is completely different. I don't have an experience or memory of it, and I enjoy the novelty. Very few people actually do that. Yeah.
How to write like Krish Ashok, especially since you come from this tech coding world.
Yeah. So there's nothing special. So in fact, if anything, right, I would argue that I'm not like a great writer in the sense that good writers have a way of looking at the world in a very visual way, and then constructing a narrative form that is able to explore the inner side as well as the outer side. I mean, how they say in ancient Tamil poetry, the agam and the puram, right? And I would not consider myself a classically good writer in that sense. So I make up for that shortcoming by focusing on things like, can I explain complex ideas in simple ways, right? So science and mathematics and chemistry and so on. And the other cheat is humor, right? I think your humor sometimes can allow you to get to people in ways, right? So for example, a lot of humorists, right, are considered good writers but not great writers. So P.G. Wodehouse is considered an amazing humor writer, but he's not considered at the level of a Charles Dickens or Salman Rushdie for that matter, right? But so for me, I think I've enjoyed humor as a vehicle for explaining things to people and making those observations as well.
Give personality as much as you can gauge it from the online consumption of it. There is a nerd side to it.
Yes.
You talk about chemistry, mathematics, but it's also someone who takes delight in the lighter side of life.
Yeah.
Who jokes really, and lands those jokes and all that.
Yes.
Who do you credit this to? Where is this coming from?
So I would actually say, on the one hand, right, it struck me that in the last 1 year, right, I've roughly posted about, say, 100 videos, right? Each of those videos is 90 seconds long. So that's actually a net total of roughly about 2.5 hours, 150 minutes of actual time that people see. So in a sense that when people say, I've seen a lot of you on videos, they've only seen 2.5 hours of me, right? If you spend a weekend with me, you're probably going to see me for a longer amount of time. It's an illusion that way. But that said, it's also, you're seeing a very curated sense, right? So for example, an Instagram reel is essentially a writing project of 250 words. That's what it is, right? The effort that goes into picking what you will choose to speak and what you will choose to leave out, because you do have to leave out things. You do not have enough time, right? And in a sense, also remember that the person who's watching you is just one thumb swipe away from not watching you and moving to something else. So the ability to keep them engaged is an entirely different skill than what it takes to make, say, a successful movie, right? Making a 90-second video or a reel is a different writing skill, meaning that somebody who makes great movies may not make great reels, and somebody who makes great reels may not make great, YouTube or long form videos and so on, right? So in that sense, I think the writing somehow needs to capture, one, it has to make sense. It has to have a small sense of surprise, but it also cannot be predictable, right? It has to leave the person with, I learned something interesting that I find worth sharing with someone else, right? And I think, so it's those kind of things that go into writing for this medium particularly.
So typically, how long it would take for you to create a video?
Yeah, so that's the interesting thing. So I normally because I have a day job, I only do 2 videos a week, right? I shoot them on the weekends. Because of my background in technology, I use AI to significantly reduce the amount of time. The other thing that people assume is that I have a team of people doing research and doing my video editing. No, I shoot it on my selfie camera and I use AI tools to edit. And end to end, the entire thing takes about 20 minutes per video, including shooting.
Which are these AI tools?
So there are multiple AI tools. I use Gling. There are plugins that I use in Premiere Pro. So what they do is that they allow me to, for instance, not have to bother with teleprompters. I can just look at a sentence, look at the camera, read, look at another sentence, look at the camera, and then the AI tool actually edits out all the gaps. And I use generative AI to generate a lot of the images and overlays that I do now. The entire process actually takes roughly about 20 minutes, right? And so that's what is. So the couple of things. One is that people often tell me, why don't you use a better, high quality design studio to add all these nice transitions? One of the things you'll notice in my videos, no transitions, no music, none of those special effects, no fancy animations and all that. And to my credit, the way I've thought about it is that it's not that I cannot do it. Of course, I can hire someone to do it. But that's not what I want to spend time on, right? I actually want to keep it a constraint where can I engage someone else purely with 90 seconds of storytelling? Not animation, not special effects, not drone shots. All of that stuff is essentially things that other people do in order to engage the audience, right? They use special effects and all of that. But for me, it's no, can I simply use writing and the oldest skill that human beings have, which is persuasively talking to someone else, and just use nothing else but that.
This is the science behind Krish Ashok's Instagram play.
Yes.
There's a political question I wanted to
Yes.
ask. You take pride in saying, in where you come from, in talking about where you come from and
Yes.
the culture that
Yes.
you live in and all that.
Yes.
Recently, after the elections, there was this talk about, the BJP couldn't make inroads in the south because there's a cultural difference between,
Yes.
these two places.
Yes.
Do you think that is true?
See, I think India is tremendously diverse. And as far back as ever since independence. Actually, you can actually argue even before independence, right? Because I think elections used to happen even before independence, right? We had the electorates and the presidencies used to have their elections and all of that, and we kind of inherited that system. You have turned it into universal suffrage and so on. I think there is a recurrent trend from the days of the anti-Hindi protests of the 1950s and 60s in Tamil Nadu to all the things that have happened of essentially the general lack of imagination in Delhi about the sheer diversity of the country. I mean, there is so many, thousands of languages, so many eating habits, right? And I end up encountering this all the time, that obviously a small, tiny number of people who cannot seem to accept that people in South and East and other parts of India eat different foods, right? That 99% of the South and East India is meat eating, right? And that most of the vegetarians are in the North and West. And even there, they're not the majority, right? But they're majority of the people generally in political power and so on. So I generally think that India has always been diverse, but we did not have social media. Okay? So the combination of social media, politics, and a desire to kind of homogenize and so on, all is what is causing that sort of tension where all of a sudden people are exposed to way more things than their brains can handle. Anyone sitting anywhere can now leave a comment, right? You can have somebody just posting a recipe of something they cooked, right? Some fish curry, and there'll be somebody who will leave a comment saying that fishing is bad, you're killing life and all. So you will not say that if you go to somebody's wedding, right, and eat dinner and say that to their face, that how can you cook non-veg? You won't say that, right? But somehow people think it's acceptable on social media, and it's that broader freedom to do that is sort of also reflected in the larger socio-political environment that we actually live.
You talk a lot about culture,
Yes.
music, and science.
Yes.
Two things that are the intersection of these things to my mind is Ilayaraja's music and
Yes.
A.R. Rahman's music.
Yes.
Was it like quite a shock for you when the shift happened from Ilayaraja to Rahman? And also, the facts and figures of these musicians, their music, that will, you can learn it from these three books. But
Yes.
the touch and feel of living through that.
Yeah.
How do you make a science of explaining that to your grandkids?
Very, very hard. So sometimes it is, in a sense, I am exactly that transition generation, meaning that my teenage years were spent listening to Ilayaraja, right? And then late teenage is when all of a sudden Roja happened and that happened, and then there's this completely new universe of music. And so there are multiple transitions that are happening, right? One is the Ilayaraja to Rahman transition in film music, right? And then there is the entire pre-technology and post-technology period, right? In terms of by Rahman's time, urban people could afford like computers. At least rich people could afford computers and so on. And we kind of knew what digital was going to happen, right? So there is that larger technological shift in society as well, right? And then as a result of that, the mechanics of how you make music are also completely changed, right? So in the sense that Ilayaraja had to get 100 musicians all at one shot, play the whole thing in one shot and record everything, right? And Rahman could simply call the singer one night and record 30 takes, right? And then call a bunch of other instrumentalists and really let them go wild, and then use digital editing to then pick out and create soundscapes that was simply technically not possible. A lot of the stuff that you hear in Rahman's music is not replicatable using real instruments in a live setting. You do have to use synthesizers and so on, right? Whereas Ilayaraja literally had to use the guitar, had to use the simple keyboard, had to use like bass guitar. And so the mechanics of how they produce music and how they orchestrate and compose are all completely different. And so which is why I'm also the generation that finds it funny when hardcore Ilayaraja fans are like, no, Rahman music is not good enough. And hardcore Rahman fans are like, nah, that music is produced poorly, sound quality is not there, it's overrated. It's like, are you guys kidding me? These are two entirely, it's like comparing, Hyderabad biryani and another Kolkata's biryani and saying which one is better. This is completely meaningless. These are completely two different things, right? And I think So for me, it was quite fascinating because I've been able to enjoy both in its own context, right? I don't bother, doing all of these silly comparisons. Of course, as a person who simply grew up with, I'm probably more biased towards Ilayaraja's music. In that, I think if you're into music theory, if you're into a little bit of, if you're a musician, I think Ilayaraja is a musician's musician, meaning that you will find more sophistication and depth in some of the arrangements, the sheer creativity of the compositions themselves, in a way that I think, of course, you're going to find that in Rahman's music as well, but not to the sheer scale and density that you will find here. Yeah.
In the sense that since you know about this, you know that he brought class to the mass. He brought all these Western musical things to
Yeah,
the masses. And
yes.
so, living through that generation,
Yes,
how
yes.
did it feel like?
It was, so here's the interesting thing. So if you remember, during the Ilayaraja time, it was pre-liberalization, has also meant that like most people, unless you were like very rich, couldn't afford to buy like Western music cassettes or CDs and all that. It was very expensive for most people, right? You had to pirate and record from radio and all of that, right? So for us, what was fascinating was that while I couldn't listen to, say, funk music from the US, I can name a bunch of Ilayaraja songs that were about as funk as it gets. There are jazz songs, there are Ilamai Ido Ido. So like, that general rock and roll kind of feel, right? And then you had Punnagai Mannan's Western classical, Bach-like Western classical feel.
This was one example of how it blended.
Right, so for instance, Ilamai Ido Ido is a classic example of a disco funk kind of a backing, right? So you have the wah-wah guitar and the drums and the brass band. So that's your classic funk arrangement, right? But then the singing is about as Indian as it gets. It's a SPB really sort of singing to that Kamal Hassan song in that setting, right? I'm singing about youth and that the 1970s and 80s, that idea of wearing the bell bottoms and that sort of having fun and so on, right? It's a classic adaptation of what funk meant in the context of the American culture, from Black African American culture, and bringing it into the context of a Tamil music here, right? And likewise, you take the soundtrack of, say, Punnagai Mannan, right? The pathos and the tragedy in the violence in all of that is a very much a Western classical idea of how pathos from Chopin and those kinds of musicians, right? So the beauty of Ilayaraja was that you couldn't afford to buy Michael Jackson CD, Dire Straits, and all of that. But you can hear all those genres in one film soundtrack. Because one song will be funk, one song will be folk, just tabla and some beautiful singing, right? And one will be sort of like a very pop, like, Iniye Ponnilave, which is your Yesudas singing that, right? And then you would have like 5 genres in like literally one album.
Behind the things that we see on social media, behind the author that we see in the book, is there like another Krish Ashok? Like, is he a sentimental person? Is he an emotional person? Is he an introvert? What kind of Krish Ashok is there behind the?
It's hard to say. I think so. For sure, I would not say I'm introverted, but in the sense that I'm more comfortable in either very small groups or very large groups where I'm like, there's a 20 feet distance that I'm speaking to on a stage, right? But I'm absolutely not a fan of parties, of mingling with 20 people, staying in touch with a lot of family members. I'm like, no, absolutely. I'm barely in touch with like school friends. So in that sense, I think there is that. But otherwise, I think I forever find myself encountering moments where I learn and understand something about the science of something, and when it suddenly clicks in your head, right? It's like, oh, this is why, and there's this history, and all of this complexity is what makes this happen. That actually is a pretty emotional, sort of like a awe-struck moment, right? So I think, as they say, like a lot of people, there's a famous philosopher who said that a lot of people who are in awe at the majesty of something, right, in a religious sense, only do so because they don't quite understand how it works. And the moment you understand how something works, then it's a different kind of awe. It's not the, oh, it's great, it must be God, it must be some religious entity who created this. Versus no, an insanely complex chain of evolutionary mechanisms and DNA and RNA and conditions and a whole range of things, biochemistry had to happen for this particular, for you to be able to say, smell a biryani, like for example, right? And so that I think is I always find that quite fascinating. Yes.
Your top 5 food joints in Kerala.
Oh man, I think all, I would imagine all 5 of them are probably here. Because I think the last time I came here last year, so it's interesting. Every time I travel to a new city, I normally just post out on Instagram asking, hey, those who are locals, give me recommendations, right? Calcutta and Calicut were the 2 cities where I got the most number of recommendations. And these were like Malayalis who left Calicut 20 years ago, live in the Bay Area. You need to go there and eat, but I'm not sure it's still there, but you need to go there and eat. The people are so clearly, I think the Paragon, right? Yeah, clearly, Adamant Chayakada. And then there was another barbecue place that's also run by the Paragon Group that I also absolutely enjoyed. M Grill also I absolutely loved. Sagar. And then there is a fish meals place whose name I forget.
Samudra.
Yes, that's one. So
Thanks a lot.